Morning, church family. We're going to be in Luke 22, first 7 verses this morning. That's page 881 in the Pew Bible. It was a weird announcement. I'm just going to say it. It was a weird announcement. Not that you did anything wrong, Doc. It was beautifully done, but it was weird. And I think it was weird because it's all becoming real, right? For those of you who this is your first week, this is our first week without our senior pastor the last 10 years. And there's some awkwardness about that. There's just some things just don't feel quite the way that they normally do. We're also, he took his wife with him, as he should have, who was our worship director. So we're feeling pains, unusual pains. I was reflecting on it this week, and I realized there are probably some of you here, some of you younger people here, talking to you, Bennett, there are probably some younger people here who have never experienced a pastor leaving their church. When I was about 8, I was born in 1981. I was born in 1981, and 1988, roughly October-ish, I got this really incredulous feeling that George H.W. Bush was going to replace Ronald Reagan. I had never had any other president other than Ronald Reagan, and I know that Dan Lant will agree with me. There shouldn't be any other president other than Ronald Reagan. Not a political statement, the country, my whole life, Ronald Reagan had led it. He just felt like he should be the president. Some of you are probably experiencing that and wondering, what is going to happen? Are we going to become communists? It's very good, the season that we are entering. Not easy, but good. There are things that a church realizes once they have lost their senior pastor, for whatever reason. There are things that they begin to realize they let him do, encouraged him to do, that he took on and was happy to do, that the rest of the church should have been doing. And in that time, there are muscles in the church that have atrophied. And so it's really good for us to experience a short season, not a long season, but a short season in which we find, oh, these are muscles we're supposed to be using. And when they have atrophied and we start to use them again, that hurts. It's painful. Some of you are already experiencing some of that pain. And we are all walking through this season figuring it out together. So I just want to encourage you as we do walk through this season of probably more unusual announcements. If any of you want to go look at the Constitution, hilltown.church/beliefs, you can read through all 15 articles to your heart's content. Actually, Jeff Drake probably has a paper copy on him right now. There's hard and awkward and challenging in front of us. But it is good. God is refining his church in the midst of it. You will get to do things. You will be called on to do things that are important for the body, that are important for the glory of God. I didn't plan to say any of that, so I'm already behind. So let's take a look at Luke 22, the first 7 verses, short little passage. page 881 in your Pew Bibles. Luke writes, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed." The word of the Lord. This is an interesting passage, at least some because it reminds me of the book of Esther, not because there's a queen in it or that it's in a foreign land, but because it doesn't actually contain the name of Jesus anywhere in it. He's not mentioned. He's referred to, and you'll notice that there are a couple spots. Some of your translations may actually put Jesus in there. They've added that just for clarification. But his name's not referenced. God's name is not referenced in the section. But make no mistake, this passage is not about Judas, and it's not about the chief priests or the officers or the scribes. This is about the God who is eternally transcendent and immanent, the one who is far above us, lofty and high, whose thoughts and ways are not ours, and whom we can't really grasp. And he is also incredibly near, close, one of us. And the message of this passage is to draw near to him with all that you have. It's about a God who is utterly transcendent, far and high above us, and so close and so near that we can't ever escape from him. The passage starts out with the chief priests and scribes having a conversation amongst one another. And if you'll remember, we've come from several days earlier. Jesus arrives into Jerusalem. He rides in on the donkey on Sunday and Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. He has a conversation with all of the people in the temple area where literally thousands of people can gather. And he teaches all day, and then he goes back out of the city, down into the valley across the Kidron, and up onto the Mount of Olives where he and the disciples camp out overnight. And he comes back and does the same thing. And in the midst of this back and forth, there is also an academic, or some might even look at it and say a spiritual back and forth between him and the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sanhedrin and all the other religious leaders. And at some point during this week, and in reality, it's been happening at other times, but at this point during the week, they're really keyed up. The scribes and the Pharisees get together and they plot, how do we get rid of this guy? And not how do we do a political hack job? How do we just move him off the scene? How do we murder him? But in a way that allows us to do it legally, and there's a formal execution, and we don't look so bad. How do we do that? Well, it should be pretty simple. If you look down just a little bit to verse 4, it tells us that Judas went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers, which is a little different than what we see in verse 2, right? It's not the chief priests and officers that are seeking how to put him to death. It's the chief priests and scribes. Why the change? Well, the officers would have been Roman guards assigned to the temple for security and safekeeping, order keeping, that sort of a thing. And so when Judas goes to betray Jesus, he actually meets with the Pharisees, or the chief priests, the spiritual leaders, but he also meets with the muscle. He actually builds his strategy for exactly what are we going to do when you show up at the Mount Thursday night while we're out there praying. The Greek word for the officers is strategeos. You might hear strategy in there. He is plotting his strategy with the strategic officers that are part of the temple court. How to execute him isn't really the problem. They've got that all under control. Their real problem is that they fear the people. They know, it's kind of remarkable, absent of any type of social media, Facebook, Twitter, it's sort of remarkable the power that the people had over these spiritual overlords in Jerusalem. But they knew if they came to arrest him in the midst of the temple court, imagine 10, 20, maybe 30,000 gathered, listening to Jesus teach. They knew if they came to arrest him there, that 10 to 20 to 30,000 people would just go nuts. And who knows what might happen at that point. Who might be crushed in the melee that ensued. And so we see here this fear of the people restraining them just a little bit. But not so much that they didn't have inner conversations wondering, how can we do this? And the answer is Judas. So Judas, we're told by Luke, is entered into by Satan. He says, then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. And Luke is not about writing down superfluous details that we don't necessarily need to know. Every detail that is there for a purpose. So why does he tell us that? Why does he tell us that he's called Iscariot and that he's one of the number of the 12? I think there's a negative and a positive reason that he gives, or that he has in mind. One is he wants to make it really clear which Judas we're talking about. Because Judas was actually a fairly common name at that time. In fact, Jesus has a brother, half-brother, named Judas, who will eventually write a letter that we refer to as Jude. And if you look at it in the Greek, it still says Judas there. But our translations render it as Jude. Well, why do they do that? Well, because Judas has a really bad connotation. You don't hear a lot of new baby announcements. You know, we were going to name him after his father, but we both just really like the name Judas. Right? That doesn't happen. There's a negative connotation there. One summer in college, I went down to visit my dad. He had just gotten a new Springer Spaniel. He introduced me to the Springer Spaniel. It's an English breed, for those of you who don't know. I said, what are you going to name him? He said, I was thinking Winston. I said, you're going to name him after a cigarette? He said, no, after Winston Churchill. I said, you can do what you want, Dad, but people are going to think you named him after a cigarette. My brother comes into town several hours later. He meets the dog, says to my dad, what'd you name him? My dad, beaming, says, I named my English Springer Spaniel Winston. My brother says, you named him after a cigarette? I said, I told you, Dad. There's this negative connotation that is immediately assigned to the name, so much so that the Christian community just stopped using the name altogether because it had such a negative effect on those who would hear it. And so one of the things that Luke is doing here in specifying, look, this was Judas, the one who's called Iscariot, which is his last name. Judas Iscariot is essentially Simon Bar Jonah is referenced in another portion of the Gospels when Jesus is speaking to him. Bar Jonah is his last name, essentially. And so he's identifying specifically which Judas we're talking about, and if he's not clear enough, he's one of the 12. Now that's kind of the negative side of it. He doesn't want anyone to misassign the betrayer to some random guy who happened to be named Judas at the time. The other reason that Luke goes into the detail of who this guy was, not so much his last name, but that he was one of the 12, is that it paints for us the picture of just how damaging a wound it was for Jesus. We sort of get that in verse 2 that the chief priests and the scribes would be seeking how to put him to death. We've kind of come to expect that from him. In fact, even the extra-biblical, the secular literature, Josephus, for instance, the historians of the first century, they tend to record really similar interactions with the Jewish religious leaders. They viewed them to be kind of nasty guys to most people most of the time. We've kind of come to expect it from them. We don't expect that Jesus is going to experience the betrayal from one of the 12. And Luke pinpoints for us the height and the depth of the pain that Jesus experiences because he's betrayed by one so close to him. We'll get more into that in a little bit. So he goes away, confers with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him. Again, they discuss strategy there, decide on when, how, what time. And it says they were glad and agreed to give him money. Now, this is a reference to the chief priests and the officers and presumably the scribes. They were glad. Their problem had been solved, no less by one of Jesus' own. It couldn't have worked out any better for them. In fact, I would guess that they saw providence all over it. This worked out in our favor better than we could have drawn it up. This is an example of, and I'm quoting something they might say, this is an example of Habakkuk 1. God has done something we wouldn't have believed he could do, even if he had told us he was going to do it. Their response to one of the worst moments in human history is joy and gladness, and they agree to give him money. And it says, so he consented. It's interesting, the term in the Greek is ex, and you'll recognize this, homologeo. Ex homologeo. In the book of James, James encourages the believers to confess their sins to one another. The word confess is ex homologeo. But here in this context, it's essentially referencing the agreement that is entered into. It's essentially saying they shook on it. It's just incredibly ironic that in saying the same thing, that's exactly what homologeo means, that in saying the same thing together between both groups, Judas betraying his master, the scribes and Pharisees betraying the creator of the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They both agree that they are saying the same thing, and at the same time condemn themselves that they're not saying the same thing God says. There's this incredible irony that exists. And so, verse 6, he consented, they shook on it, and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. Do it under cover of night. There's a word there in verse 6 that caught my eye when I began to study this. It's opportunity. If you'll remember, just a few verses back in chapter 21, Jesus says, you know what, there's going to be a time when you're going to be betrayed by those closest to you, by your moms and your dads and your brothers and your sisters, and you're going to be delivered up to synagogue rulers and to kings. And in that moment, this is going to be your opportunity to bear witness, to be my witness. And I wondered, is that the same word? Is Judas here squandering some opportunity? Is he just perverting the word that exists there? And the answer is no. He is perverting all that is good. There's no doubt about that. But the words are not the same. In chapter 21, when Jesus says, look, when you are delivered up, when you are betrayed, handed over to authorities, and persecuted for my name's sake, this is your opportunity. The word is apabino. Literally, it means to rise up from. This is your moment to shine, to come out of the ashes of the mire in which you are surrounded, and to declare the glory and majesty of the God whom you serve. It's to rise up from. In Judas's case, here in verse 6, it's ou kairos. One word, ou kairos. It's actually two words that are just joined together. Ou actually means good, ironically, and kairos is time. He's just looking for an opportune time. When's the best time to do the best thing for me? The opportunity that he sees in front of him is entirely different from the opportunity that Jesus talks about that you and I will have at some point to be his witnesses in the worst of times. This passage is about a God who is utterly transcendent, lofty and high and far above any of us. We are not worthy to stand in his presence, nor are we worthy to kneel or sit or be face down. And yet, he is also incredibly near. He is the God who, when we were still sinners, sent his Son here to become like us, to die for us, so that we could become like him. Just a few verses earlier, in chapter 21, Jesus says, this is going to be your lot in life. You're going to be betrayed, delivered up to those who have great authority and power over you. And here we are, and Jesus is experiencing the same thing. This is actually his opportunity to bear witness to what the Father has given him to do. And so I say that this passage is about those two things, right? His loftiness and greatness, but also his nearness. And one of the things that I think is so evident in this passage is that Jesus is our great high priest who is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. He walks through all of the difficulty, all of it, that you ever will. And he does so in absolute perfection and radiance, entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. He is the one that we can look to in any difficulty when we are facing any foe. He has every experience that we will ever go through, and yet he is without sin. Do you ever feel alone in your suffering? Do you ever wonder, God has got to see what's happening here. Why does he not stamp this out? Jesus has been in that position. It's interesting, the focus of this passage, just on the face of it, is Judas and this other group that are so bent on getting their own way, on accomplishing their own will, that they are willing to murder not just an innocent man, but their creator, the one who came to die in their place. They can't see that in their either fear of man and lust for power, or in their greed for power and money, that they are preferring their own way above the God they claim to serve. In all of human history, there has only been one person ever that had the right to do whatever he wanted, to exalt his will above anyone else's. And he's the guy that doesn't need to be named in this passage. He's the one who says, I don't actually have any words of my own. All the words that I have come to me from my Father. I actually don't have any will of my own. My will is to do that which the Father has given me to do. There's a warning for us in this passage, to be sure. We know from other passages that the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, but the fear of man is also a warning in this passage. Some really heinous things have happened in our world because people were afraid of other people. The one that I think tends to happen most, I hope, happens most for most of us in this room. Chris actually referenced, wherever Chris is, during his prayer of confession. We have someone in front of us that we know needs the gospel, and we totally clam up. Because we're afraid. We're afraid of how we're going to be perceived. We're afraid of what it's going to cost us. We are afraid of the human being standing right in front of us. There is a bit of the scribes and the chief priests in all of us, because we're human. There's a bit of Judas in all of us, because we're human. So what's the remedy? Well, again, Luke doesn't write things just for the word count. I don't know if you, I was reminded by my brilliant, almost high schooler. He will be in high school in, a week and a half, 2 weeks? What is it? Bobby Copy, you would know, but you don't know anymore, do you? It's an inside joke. I'll tell you later. We were talking about a list of books, and I said, I'd like to see more of the classics on here. And my son said, just because they're old doesn't make them good. And I said, that's precisely what it means. But I said it really calmly and, in a very wise and almost monotone response. And he said, "Have you ever read The Christmas Carol? That is totally boring." And I said, "Well, you got to be careful with Dickens because Dickens got paid to write by the word. I mean, like, I mean, he's not an idiot, right? I mean, you get paid to write by the word, what do? You write a lot of words, right? There's no sense in just, brevity. That's ridiculous. You write a lot of words. Luke didn't get paid by the word. He likely didn't get paid at all. So one of the questions I have is, why does he need a verse 1 if he has a verse 7? Why does he need a verse 1 if he has a verse 7? Let me read to you verse 7. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Now let me read you verse 1. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover. Those sound pretty similar, don't they? Did Luke make a mistake? Did he not realize he was being redundant? Well, we know that's not the case, because this here is the God-breathed word of life. So why then does Luke need a verse 1 if he has a verse 7? I mean, verse 7, it's beautiful. It's a just natural transition, right? The chief priests and Judas, they have their meeting, and then voila, verse 7. Then came the day of unleavened bread. This is the day on which Judas is going to betray Jesus. It's perfect. These two verses function as cosmic bookends and center for us exactly where this story fits in the grand scheme of God's redemptive plan. He says, the day of unleavened bread was coming. Some stuff happened, and the day of unleavened bread came. And what Luke wants each one of us to see is that none of this took God by surprise. None of it happened in such a way that he had to zag. Right? There is no zagging with God, right? You zig, he doesn't zag, he stays put. He is the constant. He is the unmoved mover. He does not move, you do. He does not move, they do. Luke puts for us in remarkable clarity that God, in his sovereignty, is allowing all of these things to take place in order to accomplish his will. That he would bring to fruition what was foretold long ago, thousands of years back in Egypt, when God brought his people out of slavery, out of bondage, and did so under the institution of a sacrifice, of a lamb that was slain for them, that protected them from the one who would judge all of Egypt. And here we have a scapegoat being prepared. Luke tells us, then the day came on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. This is not an accident. This is a declaration by the God who made everything, that his will always be accomplished. You cannot thwart it. He is the God that is lofty and bigger and greater than anything you can possibly imagine. And he is also the one who understands your simplest frailties. He's the one that's able to deal with both. He's not too big to notice your tiny complaints. He's not too small to be able to do nothing about them, even if that is just simply to change your heart, which is no small feat. The God that is talked about in this passage, who actually isn't referenced, is a God who desires deep, intimate, personal relationship. He's the one that can save you from the greatest of foes, and the one that will preserve you through the deepest of valleys. And the way that we walk in his steps is to mirror his attitude. That attitude's referenced in the book of Philippians. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. Though he existed in the form of God, didn't consider that a thing to be grasped, but he humbled himself. Judas never humbled himself. The chief priests certainly never humbled themselves, and we get lots of indication of that. The one who humbled himself is the one who came out victorious. We are going to see over the next several chapters more suffering and more sovereignty. Let's pray together. Father, it is easy to get distracted by the wind and the waves, and to see the injustices of the world, and to shout and holler and wonder who's going to fix all of this. And sometimes, God, I forget that you are in control. Father, it is easy to holler and clamor than to trust. And so, Father, I pray that you would help us to be humble servants who recognize that we are not nearly so strong as we think we are, and that we do need you to accomplish things that are far beyond us. And God, it is good and marvelous and brain-splitting to know that you are intimately concerned with those details that trouble us to no end. So, Father, thank you for your power and greatness and transcendence that spans time and space that I cannot grasp or begin to even wrap my brain around. And thank you that you are also ever near, so much so that there's nowhere I can go from your presence. I pray these things through the Son and by the Spirit. Amen.